So let's get started, even though it's a bit hot. I sent an email. Let's see how and when they can react. Okay, so it's a great pleasure to be here. I think we'll be together for about 20 hours or so, for a lecture at least. And we're going to talk about memory and memory systems and memory-centric computing systems. I think this is a very fascinating topic to me. I've been working on this for a long time, actually, starting with my PhD. My PhD thesis was on tolerating long memory latencies, designing processors such that you can tolerate long memory latencies. And then I moved on to doing more work on memory systems in general. And I realized it's better to be memory-centric than processor-centric. And we will talk about that as part of this course. But I will first start with motivating the importance of memory and talking about some trends to begin with. And then I'd like to get to know you also, since we are a small group over here. I assume everybody's a PhD student here? No masters or undergrads? I assume not. Okay, PhD students, that's great. Yeah. So hopefully we can go faster in some of these things. But feel free to ask questions or interrupt me. We don't need to cover everything, because this topic can go on forever. And I have a lot of material that could take us forever almost. But the most important thing is for you to learn and ask questions and hopefully develop ideas that could aid your PhD thesis or research downstream. Of course, you may have different goals, and you can let me know. Okay, so let's start with my introduction first. Basically, you may know this, but I'm a professor at ETH Zurich, not so far from here. I've been there for about a little bit more than 3 years, maybe close to 4 years now. Before that, I was at Carnegie Mellon University. I still have a small group at Carnegie Mellon. I have some PhD students that are finishing up. I got my PhD from UT Austin a while back in 2006. And after that, I started the computer architecture group at Microsoft Research. We did a lot of interesting things, which we will talk about some of those. And I spent a lot of time in industry after that also. After Microsoft Research, I moved to Carnegie Mellon as a professor. And even before, while I was a graduate student, and after I was a professor, I spent a lot of time in industry like Intel, AMD, Google, VMware. And we do interact a lot with companies, and I'll tell you some stories related to that also. We do a lot of collaborative research to push the state of the art forward. And this is my website. This is my email address. I have an ETH email address also. You can use that as well. Doesn't matter, but feel free to email me with anything. And you'll get to see that site a lot, because a lot of the things that I'm going to cover will be based on the publications that are on that site. I do research and teaching in computer architecture, computer systems, hardware security, and bioinformatics. Actually, we will start a little bit with bioinformatics today as a motivating example. A lot of work on memory and storage systems, hardware security, safety, predictability. Let me see. Okay, let me control this a bit over here. You're not seeing this, but this is the recording that's happening. Okay, that's better. We do a lot of work on fault tolerance, hardware-software cooperation, architectures for bioinformatics, health, and medicine. I'm very interested broadly in computer science and electrical engineering. I see all of it as a continuum, as you will see in some of the pictures over here. So I'm more opportunistic in the types of research we do. So this is by no means limiting. This is a busy slide on some of the topics. I actually used to present this slide to PhD students who were just starting their PhDs at Carnegie Mellon. Basically, these are some of the topics that we're focusing on: memory and storage, DRAM, flash, and emerging memory technologies, non-volatile memory technologies, for example. We do a lot of work on interconnects, and this is, I think, very important to know interconnection networks, because they're really one of the major bottlenecks in systems today. And if we have time, we'll cover, one of the lectures will be on interconnection networks. Heterogeneous and parallel systems, graphics processing units, and systems for data analytics. I think these are buzzwords maybe, but all of the systems that we have today are heterogeneous and parallel. Like if you look at this one, this is actually one of the highest performance systems that we have today, given the energy budget. It's very energy efficient and high performance, but there's a lot of heterogeneity inside this, lots of hardware accelerators, for example. And we want to put more heterogeneity into the system by making components like main memory and interconnects more active participants in the computation. Today, if you look at a system, you have processors, different processors, and then memory. And they're very separate from each other, right? There's this processor-memory dichotomy. And if you really want to have a more distributed processing, much more efficient processing, you would like to put processing capability inside the memory as well. And that's going to be one of the major topics that we'll cover in this course. And that's what I mean by new execution models over here. And new execution models usually require new interfaces as well, like the software interface, the programming interface, as well as the hardware interfaces to enable that. We're going to talk a lot about this intersection of hardware security, energy efficiency, fault tolerance, and performance. Today, actually, with scaling, as transistor scaling has slowed down, we're having a lot of difficulties in fault tolerance, energy efficiency, and performance. And also, that's leading to hardware security issues, as we will see. I'll use this as a motivation. I think this is very exciting. Understanding that space, how these four different things interact is very important. I'm also very interested in genome sequence analysis and assembly algorithms and architectures for it. And I'm going to start with that, as I mentioned. And I'm also very interested in biologically inspired systems and system design for bioinformatics and medicine. I think these are actually areas that we haven't focused a lot in computer science yet, but it's going to be a lot more important going into the future, in my opinion. Maybe we can brainstorm a little bit later when we talk about processing in memory. So this is, in one slide, part of what I do. I like doing broad research spanning applications, systems, and logic with architecture, computer architecture at the center. Computer architecture is really the hardware-software interface and how you design the components of a system. Okay, how many of you are doing PhDs in computer architecture here? Okay, somewhat. How many of you are doing PhD? But everybody's in computer science, right? Okay, there's consensus there. Maybe we'll discuss more on what you're exactly doing. Actually, that's going to be one of the first assignments due tonight. You're going to send me an email describing what you do. But we'll discuss it here also sometime. Okay, so in this cover, basically, we're going to cover everything, essentially. Of course, we're not going to cover everything in a lot of breadth. We're going to go into some depth and some breadth. And we're going to the focus will be on memory and storage systems. But I'm going to start with genome sequence analysis. This is actually something very interesting, so I'm going to highlight this one in a little bit. But these are some of the four key directions that we're pursuing in my group right now. I say key directions because these things change, but these are four key directions that remain constant, that have remained constant for a while. We're looking at how to fundamentally architect the system such that they're more secure, reliable, and safe. How to fundamentally make systems much more energy efficient. And that's, in my opinion, that requires memory-centric thinking and memory-centric design, or maybe data-centric design. We're going to talk a lot about that. And how to make things more low latency. So we're definitely going to touch all these three. And we're going to start with this part, actually, reliability and security. And then we're going to move to energy efficiency, and we're going to move to latency. But I'm going to use this to motivate everything else over here. How many of you have studied bioinformatics? Anybody? No one. Okay, this is going to be completely new to you then. That's good. You may not understand everything that I'm going to talk about. And I'm not going to also go into a lot of detail in this one. But this is going to be a motivating application. Anybody studied biology in the past, in high school? Yes? Who studied biology in high school? Not everyone? Okay, so you don't have biology in high school? And maybe basic. Yeah, sure, basic, yeah. But do you know what a cell is? What DNA is, what RNA is. So, okay, yeah, that's what I mean by biology. Nothing extremely. You don't need to be you don't need to have a PhD in biology. That's not what I meant. Sure. And sometimes it's hard to remember, right? Because biology is a lot of. It's very broad. Okay, but I'm going to use this as a motivating detour to motivate memory systems from a different perspective, from a more application-driven perspective. But I think this is a very important application, actually, genome sequence analysis. That's what we're going to focus on. And I'm going to motivate it with a research story. Basically, when I joined Microsoft Research in 2006, I was thinking of, like, what should we do in computing that's big? And one of the things that we were discussing with one of my friends while we were doing a hike in Mount Rainier in the beautiful Seattle area was, can we do genome analysis much faster and much more efficient than what we can do today? And this was our idea, basically, our dream. We wanted to have a very simple, small device that can sequence someone's genome and analyze it very quickly, let's say within real time. I say within a minute over here, but you can, of course, put bounds. So what does this mean? Basically, this means that you could answer questions like, which of these DNAs does this DNA segment match with? And do it like on the spot, for example. You take a DNA sample and you do it immediately. It could also mean that somebody asked this question to the device: what is the likely genetic disposition of this patient that I'm treating to this particular drug that I'm going to administer right now? And I need to do it right now because I'm going to save the patient's life, right? So it could be very life critical in that particular situation. And there could be many, many other situations that you can imagine. I cannot claim that I can imagine all of these situations, but that's the beauty of doing fundamental research in technology, right? You enable things that are hopefully good. You also enable things that are bad, but the technology could be used for many purposes. Okay, this was our dream, actually, and we wanted to do this. Clearly, this is, we believed it's important. And at that point in time, we didn't even have the device that actually sequenced people's genomes. So this is, again, very basic biology. This is what a genome looks like. Basically, it consists of a bunch of bases, A, C, G, T. If you don't remember, it's okay. It's not that important. And these are real, clearly. Every one of us has a DNA. Every living organism has this. And this is actually a very interesting one because this is a particular person's DNA, Henrietta Lacks. And her DNA was taken from her without her consent. And this actually enabled a lot of discovery in molecular biology. A lot of our understanding of the DNA is actually based on this particular DNA that was taken without somebody's consent. So today, there are actually very interesting privacy issues related to everything, including genomics, which we're not going to talk about, but it's good to think about that. Okay, let me define the problem a little bit better. Basically, in DNA sequencing or genome sequencing, the goal is to find the complete sequence of these bases, A, C, G, T's in a DNA. Once you find the complete sequence, you can basically ask these questions, like, what does this DNA resemble? Is this person have a disposition to this particular drug because his or her gene matches something that we know of? There are many questions. I'm not going to go through those clearly. The challenge is that a human DNA is 3.2 billion base pairs, for example, but there's no complete, no machine that takes this long DNA as an input and gives a complete sequence to you as output. We haven't been able to design these machines yet. People are working on it, but it turns out it's not an easy task to design such a machine. All sequencing machines today are choppers. I call them choppers. Basically, they chop the DNA into small pieces, and they identify what relatively small pieces with some error. Basically, you can think of this as a sequence of characters, A, C, T, G. And the machines are good at giving you those small pieces with some error. They're not perfect still. But they do not tell you how these small pieces fit together. So now you have a computational puzzle at hand. You have this 3.2 billion base pair DNA. And the machines give you small fragments of 150 or 300 base pairs. Now your puzzle is to figure out what the complete DNA is based on this. So it's not easy, as you can see. And that's where the computational bottleneck comes in. And I liken this to, if you have a cat, you would know maybe something like this. Basically, you have these yarn balls a cat likes playing with, and they get entangled with each other. And DNA, you can think of one as a DNA, and then you chop it into pieces, and then you don't know the complete thing, so you need to reconstruct the complete thing. And these are the choppers that we have today. It's a bit old picture, but it's not terribly old. It's from 1.5 years ago, maybe. So you can see this machine, for example, is about $3 million right now. And it gives you pieces that are of 150 or 300 base pairs. Not very long, very short, actually. And its error rates are very low, less than 1%. Error rates meaning that it does not correctly identify those ACTGs very well, right? So that's another problem that you have. You need to overcome these error rates somehow. So usually people, what's done is you sequence a DNA multiple times so that you can get confidence in terms of tolerating those errors. So this is one interesting machine, as you can see. And there are many variants of this particular company. And this machine did not exist when we were dreaming in 2006, 2007, actually. But we believed in the technology. We believed that someone would come up with a device that would sequence someone's DNA. And we today have this. It's about $1,000, $2,000. You can buy that. You can actually do your experiments on your own. People are using this right now, for example, in Africa to sequence virus DNAs so that they can understand them. It's very cheap. Now, there's an upside and downside. The upside is it can actually give you long sequences, like about 800,000 or a million base pairs. So it's better than 150 or 300 compared to this. But the problem is the error rates are very high. The error rates are about 15 to 20%. So now you need to actually do the sequencing many, many times to tolerate the errors. Okay. So you can basically, there are many, many examples. So basically, all of these machines produce data with different properties. But we know how to design these machines, basically, to some accuracy today, which is not bad, actually. We've come along a long way. And actually, this was motivated by the Human Genome Project initially, which took a long time, as you can see. And this was the first human genome that was completely reconstructed and sequenced. And that, even then, it's not complete, actually. It's about 80% of that particular genome is completely known right now. We still don't know enough. And this took a lot of time, a lot of money. Doesn't matter. But this enabled a revolution in genomics, if you will. And what was that? This is actually a very famous picture. Has anyone seen this before? I guess that's fine. It's very small on the screen, but basically what this shows is, over the years, the cost per raw megabase of DNA sequence. You can see that it's reducing, and this is Moore's law curve, cost of transistor. But at some point, people were able to design these high-throughput sequencing machines, those big machines that I showed you, that reduced the cost significantly. There was a breakthrough where they figured out how to actually sequence the DNA in a massively parallel manner. It's massive parallelism, actually. There are multiple different technologies, which I will not go into detail. I'll point you to some resources if you're really interested. And that enabled us to sequence a lot of machines. And you can see that it's reduced again over here with the introduction of the third generation sequencing, like nanopore sequencing that I showed you, those little devices. So it's actually going down much faster than Moore's law. Moore's law is actually tapering off right now, but genome sequencing is becoming much cheaper. And as a result, I mean, take this with a grain of salt. This is a picture from a company. This is the number of genomes that are sequenced, basically. So it's growing exponentially also over time. And maybe this doesn't do justice because it's from only one company over here. Okay, so basically the point is we know how to build these sequencing machines really well today. They're not ideal, but they're very fast. They're very high throughput. But we don't know how to analyze the data really well. Basically, at this point, you have a computational puzzle. You need to reconstruct the genome somehow by mapping it to a reference genome, for example. And that is actually the bottleneck today. Because once you actually do that, now you can ask questions like, where does this genome differ from other genomes? And then that could lead to scientific discovery or medical help to people who need it. So this is one example question. I'll go through this relatively quickly. If I give you a bunch of sequences, tell me where they're the same and where they're different. This could be used for many, many purposes, like discovery of different species, how close they are to each other. This is one example of different bacteria, for example, how people use it to classify different species from each other. And you can read a lot of interesting papers related to this. And this is actually a fun picture that I like. Amazingly, humans are very, very close to each other, as you can see, even though we may actually look very, very different from each other. And amazingly, a human and banana is also very close to each other, but maybe not as close as these two people. Okay, I mean, you can have fun with it also, of course, right? But this also points out to the importance of figuring out the differences really well. Because if you don't figure out the differences really well, in the end, you will have no discovery, right? The key is really finding out those, what is called variants. That's what this variant calling means over here. Variants from a reference genome or variants between different species. Otherwise, you will say everything is the same, right? So you need to be really precise when you do these studies. That's why computational accuracy is very important. So this is another example. Given a bunch of short sequences, can you identify the approximate species cluster for some unknown organism? So this leads to a lot of discovery also. Okay, so basically, we're bottlenecked in this step. We know how to do this really well, but we're really bottlenecked on this mapping. And this is one example with take this with a grain of salt again. This assumes some technology and assumes some processing power. But basically, there's a huge bandwidth bottleneck. This is very high throughput, but this is very low throughput today. And I'm going to give you an example of why it's low throughput. Well, the problem is really you need to reconstruct the entire genome from many reads, especially for really interesting studies. There are studies where you can get away without constructing the entire genome, but those are not very interesting in general. And this is called the read mapping problem. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail. At least you will know the problem, maybe not necessarily all the solutions. Basically, in the read mapping problem, we would like to map many short DNA fragments, these are called reads, sequences of base pairs, to a known reference genome with some differences allowed. Basically, the assumption is that we know the reference genome in this case, and human reference genome exists, and you would like to find the differences from that. So logically, a DNA looks like this, basically. Physically, it looks like that yarn ball. The chopper chops it into a lot of reads, and there's some reference genome, and you would like to figure out where each read goes to. Clearly, it's not an easy problem because this sequence may exist in many, many locations over here, right? And you would like to ideally identify all possible locations and eliminate the ones that don't make sense. It's fascinating, but I cannot go into a lot of detail. If you're really interested, maybe we can reserve a lecture at the very end to talk about this. But basically, this is challenging because you have many, many short reads, and you have essentially billions of 50 to 300 base pair reads. And you don't do it only once, actually. You need to do it many, many times for a single DNA because you get errors, and you would like to do this many, many times to build confidence. So usually, the tools that were designed for this compute what's called edit distance. So you have a small sequence, a fragment or read, and you want to check whether that matches a part of the reference genome. You would like to compute the edit distance of this read with the edit distance of the string in the reference genome. So what is this edit distance? You know about Hamming distance, I assume, right? Everybody knows about Hamming distance? So Hamming distance computation is very simple, right? You basically check if the characters match in equal length strings. Right? That's easy to compute. This is much harder to compute because you would like to identify the differences between the strings. This is defined as the minimum number of edits needed to make the read, the fragment, exactly match the reference segment. And edits could be insertions, deletions, or substitutions. And these all have potentially meanings in biology, basically, if there's something inserted. I like using this one over here. So if you want to compute the edit distance between Netherlands and Switzerland, this is what you get. Actually, this is one answer. There could be multiple answers, but this is the minimum answer. And there could be multiple minimum answers also. So basically, if you would like, clearly the first two things mismatch. And the T actually matches in Netherlands and Switzerland. But in order to be able to match them, you need to actually say that there's a deletion in Netherlands in place of this I in Switzerland. Right? So basically, there was this character in Netherlands that was deleted that was replaced by I in Switzerland. And now T matches. Right? And then there's a mismatch over here, and all of this actually matches. And then there is an insertion over here. Make sense? So now how do you compute this? You can imagine algorithms, but I'm not going to give you algorithms really. But this is usually computed via dynamic programming. You construct a dynamic programming matrix, Netherlands here, Switzerland here, and you basically go through all of the possibilities, and it's very, very high overhead. And imagine doing this for like 150 base pairs. You take 150 base pair read, and you try to do it at every possible location in a 3.2 billion base pair reference genome. That's a lot of work. And you do it not just for one read, you do it for every single read that comes. So that's the difficulty of computation. And this computation itself is very expensive, but you do it many, many times, that makes it even more expensive. Okay, so, but that's not it, basically. You need to find many mappings of each read. Basically, a read can be in many possible places. So how do you find all of these mappings efficiently is one question. While doing this, you need to tolerate small variances or errors in each read. Each individual is different. The subject's DNA may slightly differ from the reference because of these mismatches, insertions, and deletions. And usually, you want to figure out the possible places where you have this match up to some errors present, E. And people are trying to increase E, basically. People are trying to increase the possibility of mismatch. And as this increases, the edit distance computation becomes actually harder. It doesn't become harder, but basically you need to do the edit distance computation more so that you can get that match. Okay, and then you need to do it very fast. Performance is important, as I said. I mean, this is old, but it's easy to imagine that state-of-the-art mappers can take weeks to map a human's DNA on a single machine. If you want to parallelize it, you can of course reduce it, but now you're consuming a lot of power also. If you want to do design an embedded device, maybe you cannot parallelize it really well. Basically, how can you design a much higher performance read mapper is still a big problem. Any questions? I know this is a new area to probably everybody, but it's a fascinating area to me, and I don't go into a lot of detail here at this point. So when we first started, we actually wanted to design a mapper that's very comprehensive, but that's still fast enough for our purpose. It's not going to be fast enough, but this is the first work we did together with folks from University of Washington Genomics department. Basically, we wanted to design the mapper that's guaranteed to find all mappings of a given fragment, because we don't want to lose anything in the process. Existing mappers actually, at that time, were very good at finding exact matches. But exact match is usually not what you want in general, because you really want the differences, especially for scientific discovery. Exact match may be very good for some special purposes, like you want a really exact match of a particular fragment in a particular location, assuming that that exact match indicates some disposition to some disease, for example. But usually they're not exact matches also. Variants are also very, very important. You may miss a lot of disease vulnerabilities if you're just looking for an exact match. So we wanted to actually have a very sensitive mapper that's guaranteed to find all mappings and that can tolerate up to E errors. And this is what we designed. I'm not going to bore you with the details. You can read this hard-to-read paper. People, when they write papers in Nature, they write hard-to-read papers. And unfortunately, I was part of that also. It's a good paper, but it's very hard to understand, I think. Anyway, so if you design such a mapper, it turns out most of its time, even though we tried not to do this as much as possible, most of its time is really spent on this edit distance computation, this dynamic programming. That's extremely costly. And then our goal was to actually get rid of that edit distance computation as much as possible, basically. Over the course of the last 6 or so years, or more than 6 years actually, we wanted to change this picture basically, such that we have a much higher performance mapper. So basically we were limited by this read mapping, as I showed you. So the key idea we followed was this. Basically we wanted to design a hierarchical mapper. The idea was not to do the edit distance computation right away, but to have a quick filter that we could design that basically told us, okay, this read that you've gotten is going to match this particular location, or it's not going to match that particular location in the reference genome. So if you can design such a filter, you can eliminate a lot of the edit distance computations that you need to do. You don't compare this read to all of the possible locations in the reference genome. You compare to only locations that you think it's going to match. The key question is, of course, how do you do that filter? Right? So this minimizes actually costly approximate string comparisons. And how you do that filter is very, very interesting. Basically, you need to take advantage of the reference genome. So this is the first work we did that takes advantage of the properties of the reference genome. And it basically designs a filter that can quickly say, okay, I'm going to check only these locations for this particular read. And again, I'm not going to give you the detailed ideas, since otherwise this will be a 2-hour lecture on bioinformatics, which is probably not why you're here for. Although if you're interested, you can certainly read the paper. It's much more accessible than the previous paper. And basically, the key takeaway over here is if you actually design such a filter, you can get rid of 99% of those edit distance computations. So you can accelerate the mapper by about 20x, according to our results. Of course, the filter needs to be quick. And then our goal was to actually make the filter really quick, because the bottleneck shifted to the filtering mechanism, and we started designing algorithms that are more SIMD friendly. So this paper, for example, introduces the idea of shifted Hamming distance. The key idea is basically you compute a Hamming distance between 2 strings that gives you the exact match and the differences. But if you shift one of the strings to the right and compute the Hamming distance of the shifted string and the baseline reference string, now what you can do is you're really emulating an insertion in one of the strings. So that tells you the distance when you have an insertion in one of the strings. And if you shift it one more time, that tells you the distance when you have two insertions in one of the strings. So you keep doing this, and now you can actually see the different Hamming distances. And if you shift it to the left, you get the deletions. And then you can compute a Hamming mask by ANDing all of those Hamming distances. And that can tell you approximate similarity of two strings whenever you have insertions and deletions allowed. This is very cool, I think. And all of that can be computed by bitwise operations. Basically, you XOR the two strings, shift one of them, XOR again, shift one of them, XOR again. So you have a bunch of results from the XORs, and then you AND all of those. And the AND result tells you whether you have a match in any of them. And then the number of matches that you get over there is an indicator of how similar these two strings are when you have insertions and deletions allowed in the strings. Of course, this is approximate. It doesn't give you the edit distance clearly, but our goal is not the edit distance. Our goal is a very quick test that tells us whether these two strings are approximately similar. And if the filter tells us they're approximately similar, then we go ahead and do the edit distance computation, which is very costly. If the filter tells us, no, they're not similar, then we don't do the edit distance computation, so we get rid of a lot of that costly computation. So this filter is very fast, and it's actually 3x faster than the closest possible filter that we had before. I like this idea quite a bit. If you're interested, you can take a look at it. And later, actually, this turns out this kind of algorithm is very easy to adapt to FPGAs. So we actually have an FPGA implementation of this that's much faster than the SIMD, single instruction, multiple data instructions in general purpose processors. This actually makes the mapper 10x faster. It makes the filter 200x faster and the mapper 10x faster. And if you're interested, you can download the source code of all of these works and test it for yourself. And this is one of the latest accelerators. This is one example architecture, internal FPGA architecture is one of the accelerators. Here we wanted to improve the accuracy at the expense of speed a little bit, but you can read the papers. And this is our newest work. Actually, this speeds up the mapper by another 10x. Again, I'm not going to go into the idea. The idea is a bit more complicated here. By looking at smaller windows of small substrings, you can actually accelerate things much faster in this case. And it turns out this, as I said, it speeds up the mapper another order of magnitude. Again, on an FPGA. Okay, so why am I telling you all of this? This is very, very interesting, I think. But we're not there yet. And the main limitation in all of these is really we're heavily bottlenecked by data moments. For example, the FPGA that I told you, the FPGA performance of this gatekeeper is limited by the DRAM bandwidth. And this is true for the shifted Hamming distance algorithm that we have on the SIMD machine. And the solution that we've been pursuing more recently is processing in memory actually can alleviate this bottleneck. And we've been looking at putting computation inside the memory for this. But to be able to do this, like any new architecture, you need to design mapping and filtering algorithms to fit the processing in memory. Again, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but maybe later, after we talk about processing in memory, we can go into this as an example application. So this particular work uses 3D stacked memory, and it puts the filtering mechanism inside the logic layer underneath memory layers. And it actually achieves much faster computation in the end. Okay, let me go through the key principles that we've exploited. Basically, in all of these works, this is actually old, but in all of these works, we exploited the structure of the genome to minimize computation as much as possible at the algorithmic level. We wanted to optimize the software so that the algorithms don't waste work. That's important. And then we also wanted to morph and exploit the structure of the underlying hardware to maximize performance and efficiency and design algorithms for that hardware. So essentially, this is really algorithm architecture co-design for a particular domain. In this case, domain is actually DNA read mapping, which is actually a very small part of the genome sequence analysis pipeline, as you will see in a couple of slides. But it's a very important part of the analysis pipeline. And in the end, we can speed up read mapping by 300x. I think it's actually sometimes more, depending on the inputs. I didn't do all of the calculations. And it improves the accuracy of read mapping in the presence of errors because the algorithmic changes. And I think this is becoming even more interesting going forward because of these devices that now exist that didn't exist before. If you really want to know about these devices and the bottlenecks, we recently written this paper surveying the tools that work on these devices. I'd be happy to talk about that separately if people are interested in this. And this is the pipeline that I mentioned, actually. Once you get data from this device, what you get is raw signals. Signals are actually current measurements. So this works using something called nanopore sequencing. Essentially, a nanopore is a nanoscale hole. What these devices do is they pass the DNA through this nanoscale hole. And while the DNA is passing through that hole, it has different currents based on the different bases that are passing. And the device basically measures that current, and it gives you these current measurements. And the first step is basically mapping those current measurements to ACTGs. And even that's not easy, actually. It's called base calling the base, basically. And there are many, many tools. A lot of them are basically, for example, this deep nano. As you can see, it's based on deep neural networks. A lot of them use machine learning algorithms. So the first step is really understanding whether you have an ACTG. And this is an important step because if you're wrong, that affects your error rate significantly. And this is the part that's one of the limiting parts in this device right now. And then you do other stuff, which I'm not going to go into details. But you find the overlaps between the reads, using a lot of graph algorithms in this case. And then you construct an assembly. In this case, we don't have a reference genome, but you basically assemble all of the reads. And there are tools for it. And then you do read mapping, and then do some polishing. And then in the end, you get the entire DNA sequence. If you're really interested, you can take a look at this paper that goes through all of these steps one by one, describes like what is needed in each step and what is the state of the art in each step. I think it's fascinating. So let me tie back. Basically, this was our dream in 2007, right? We wanted an embedded device that can perform comprehensive genome analysis in real time. So now we have a device. That's good. That's not bad, actually, because even in 2007, that device didn't exist. Clearly, that huge machine is not embedded, but this nanopore device is like this big. It's embedded. But unfortunately, we're still not there yet because we have a huge bottleneck in terms of energy efficiency, performance, latency. I cannot even think of getting close to that minute at this point yet. And security, which we even didn't tackle at this point. There's, I think, security issues that need to be tackled, but we're not there yet to tackle them. And the main reason, in my opinion, is really we have a huge memory bottleneck. Basically, we need to move the data inside the device, outside the device, and that's consuming a lot of time. We can optimize computation, and we've optimized computation a lot to minimize the movement, but you still have a lot of data to move in the end. And that's why I use this as a motivation. So if you want to have a forward-looking application like this, I believe in many, many applications, you're bottlenecked by memory. People are finding that out today with machine learning, for example. You have a huge memory bottleneck in machine learning as you increase the size of your data sets, especially. People are designing a lot of accelerators. If you look at those accelerators, I think I recently looked at Tesla's accelerator. I don't remember what they called it. Maybe you guys know. Is it V100? Something like that. Has anyone seen that? Tesla has a machine learning accelerator. It has a name. And they actually had this press release which was very nice and technical, actually. I'd recommend that you take a look at it. I'd be happy to send a link. Maybe you can remind me later. But basically, they have this accelerator to accelerate the computations, the vision computations that they're supposed to do in their self-driving cars. And if you look at the chip, most of it is SRAM. So it's not doing computation. And computations are not easy in a lot of neural networks, right? You need to do matrix multiplication, addition, and interpolation. There are many things. But most of the chip is really SRAM in the end. Why? Because they need to fit the data in there. They don't want to go to memory. So they're bottlenecked by memory also, actually. So I think a lot of these really interesting applications are going to be bottlenecked by memory going into the future to enable interesting things in the future. So, okay. So that's all I have on bioinformatics. But if you're really interested, you can watch this video. Or you can tell me via email that you really want more of this bioinformatics stuff, which we can try to accommodate in the last day or so in the course. Any questions? I don't want to be talking all the time, so yes, please.
What's the state-of-the-art calculation time?
Okay, that's a very tough question because it really depends on like what kind of computation that you're doing and also what. Oh, I see, a dream. So the dream, it assumes what kind of processor you have. So if I give you the state-of-the-art, if you want to go through the entire nanopore sequencing pipeline in a data center, not an embedded device, you can parallelize a lot. It takes at least a day. So not very close, as you can see.
That's good, because then you have more to
Exactly, exactly. The good thing is you have more to research. Basically, even in a data center, you need to reduce it, and then you need to reduce it within the constraints of something even smaller than this, right? But that's a very good question. If you're interested, this is a very open area. Okay. Any other questions? Who else finds this fascinating? Am I the only one? Okay, I see. I see people nodding. That's good. Okay, to be fair, I mean, we didn't really design the embedded device yet because we're still working on the algorithms and the FPGA. But if you look at the FPGA itself, we report a lot of numbers, and pretty much all of the memory is utilized in the FPGA. Is that what you were asking?
I would like to know how many portion in percent maybe the memory consumption in energy. I mean.
Oh, in terms of energy, it's most of the. Yeah, most of the energy is consumed.
90%.
So I think it really depends on, yeah, if you include all of the on-chip memory, of course, yes, more than 90%. Computation is very little, and computation is relatively simple here. That's why we wanted to move to processing in memory. That reduces the memory energy consumption significantly. Even if it doesn't buy, I mean, it does buy a lot of performance, but the even bigger reasoning is to actually reduce the energy consumption. Any other thoughts? Okay. So let's move on. I think I'll take a, when should we take a break? We didn't discuss the breaks, but what is your sweet spot in general? Because it's a 4-hour lecture. I can go for 4 hours, but, and I see that people are not very happy with the, yeah, I sent an email. Maybe you can send an email also? Is it possible? Yeah. I sent an email to Clarissa, who's organizing the course, but I'm not sure if we have any much control beyond this, frankly. It's at -6, and maybe this doesn't have the capability to yeah. Okay. Hopefully they'll fix it. Okay, maybe we can take a break in a natural point. Yeah. If you need a break, please let me know. At some point, I'll need a water break. Okay, so now I motivated this with an example application. Let's look at how do we actually get there, or how can we potentially get there. I'm going to start, we're going to cover all of these in this lecture and more, but we're going to focus on memory and storage. I put these two things together because I think in the future these things are going to merge somehow, memory and storage hierarchy, especially in the presence of non-volatile memory hierarchies that can enable persistent memory. But I'm going to first motivate why is memory so important, especially today, with some trends. I've already given you the application side in some way, but we're going to see more. And I think there are multiple perspectives to this. There's a performance perspective, energy perspective, and scaling, reliability, and security perspective. I'm going to cover all of these. And then we're going to talk about trends, challenges, and opportunities in main memory. But let's take a look at what we're going to focus on. In most of this course, we're going to focus on main memory, but a lot of the principles that we'll discuss are applicable to memories that are on chip as well. But the interesting thing is the memory that's on chip has been focused on a lot. The memory that's off-chip storage, that's also focused on a lot. Main memory, for some reason, has not been focused on a lot, interestingly. And this is, I think, very critical today, and it's going to be more critical going forward. And going forward, I think these two are going to merge at least at the main memory level, and maybe at the processor level, because we may actually have non-volatile memory on chip going forward, because some technologies are actually very amenable to that. But we will see. So there are going to be a lot of changes in this hierarchy. But if you look at main memory, it's a critical component of all computing systems. Whatever computing system that you design, you need to have some sort of working storage. And in modern systems, you usually have DRAM for that working storage. And if you want to improve performance and improve the scaling of your system, you need to scale the main memory system. What does that mean? Basically, you need to increase the size of it. You need to improve its technology, improve its efficiency, improve its cost, and improve its algorithms that you use to manage it. basically, you need to improve everything in memory if you want to have good performance. Because we know actually how to improve this really well. But maybe we don't know how to improve this really well today. That's going to be a big part of this course. And it doesn't matter what you put over here. You could be putting processors and caches, some FPGAs, some GPUs, some accelerators. And today, actually, we're putting a heterogeneous combination of all of those, right? This one, for example, main memory is shared by many, many accelerators. And going forward, there'll be FPGAs as well. You're bottlenecked by this connection to main memory. This is another picture that I have. This is my old hand drawing. I used Xfig to draw it. Does anybody use Xfig here? Does anybody know about Xfig? Okay, good. I don't feel that old now. Xfig is actually, I like that tool. I use that tool for a lot of the drawings in my papers. And this is a drawing from 2008, I think. I used this in a proposal to National Science Foundation in the United States at that time. But basically, if you look at a chip, this is cartoon, but real life is very similar. Computation is constrained to what is called these cores. We can think of these as accelerators also. Basically, we do computing only in these cores. Everything else is there to store data, move data, store data, move data, control the data movement and storage, move data, store data, move data, store data. I could keep going, right? Basically, most of the system that we design today is dedicated to storing and moving data. And we call this a computer, right? It's actually, most of the time, it's not doing computation. Most of the time, it's storing and moving data. And most of the resources are dedicated for storing and moving data, which is very interesting. If you actually do the calculations on different chips, you could go up to 90% of the resources dedicated to storing and moving data. Because if you look inside these cores, well, there are L1 caches over here. There are registers. And they're basically there to move and store data. Computation is actually is not a big problem today. So let's go through in one slide the state of the main memory system as I see it today. Basically, there are some recent technology, architecture, and application trends that we're going to cover that lead to some new requirements from the system and that exacerbate some old requirements. And we've demanded a lot from the system. We're going to demand a lot more from the memory system. I remember reading papers. So if you look at the paper that introduced stream buffers in ISCA 1990 by Norm Juppy, it basically says a memory access is 10 cycles, and it's a bottleneck. Today, a memory access is 500 or 600 cycles. It's much worse, basically. So basically, the requirements are exacerbated. Old requirements like latency, fast access, they're being exacerbated. And as a result, DRAM and memory controls, as we know them and as we design them today, are unlikely to satisfy these requirements. And I'm going to show you examples that they're already falling behind. And there are some emerging memory technologies that happen to be non-volatile, enable new opportunities at the same time. So it's actually a very nice time because there are these technologies that are competing with DRAM potentially soon. And these could enable new opportunities that didn't exist before, for example, merging of memory and storage, such that you can store persistent data directly into your cache or into your main memory. Given these, we need to rethink the memory system and the systems we're designing around the memory system, because today we're designing the systems around our memory system, I think, to fix the issues we're having with DRAM and to enable at least one of these emerging memory technologies, but the more the better, I think, while satisfying all the requirements. So in this course, hopefully we're going to cover all of this and more. So let me go into these trends a little bit more. Again, this is one slide summarizing the major trends that are affecting main memory as I see them. The first thing is, essentially, we want more performance out of memory. And performance comes in the form of capacity, bandwidth, quality of service, like predictability of access, and latency. I didn't put latency over here, but it's obvious that latency is important. Although we will see in a little bit that it's perhaps one of the most ignored parts of the memory chip design. So this is clear. And energy and power is important. And on top of this, we're having issues with technology scaling. So we'll cover each of these. Let's take a look at the first one. So first one is actually being, we've always demanded a lot of capacity, a lot of bandwidth. Predictability is more or less a relatively new requirement, but in real-time systems, that's also important. It becomes exacerbated with multi-core, for example, and we want low latency. But this is becoming much more exacerbated because of three major trends. Essentially, as I said, computation is not a problem. We're able to put many, many computation units on a chip whether these computation units are general purpose cores or GPUs or whatever you can imagine, we can put them. And we can clock them higher. So this is a more or less solved problem today, actually. There's a lot of research that has enabled this clearly. And we know how to make them very, very efficient also, actually. We have a lot of techniques to make them very efficient. Applications on top of this are becoming increasingly data intensive. I've given you an example from bioinformatics. But that's true for many, many other applications like databases. We basically have increasing demand and hunger for data, and we're able to generate a lot of data, essentially. Like video cameras, for example. Video analytics is another example. They're everywhere, and they're generating lots of data, much more than we can analyze. Now, we could analyze them for a good purpose or a bad purpose, but we're not able to analyze them efficiently. And on top of this, we want to consolidate more and more. What does this mean? Basically, we want to put more computation, more applications on a single node, single chip, so that we can maximize the efficiency that we have in terms of resources, in terms of area, in terms of cooling. And this is true in cloud computing, for example. You don't want to have different data centers for different applications. You want to have a single data center and put many, many applications on it. Of course, this is increasing the capacity, bandwidth, and predictability, quality of service requirements on a single node up and up, and the latency requirements. So let's take a look at a couple of these. So this is actually a graph that I borrow from HP Labs and University of Michigan from a paper that they wrote in 2009 in ISCA. They plotted the core count, and they plotted the memory capacity, essentially, that you can attach to a single node. And they basically showed that core count is increasing much faster than memory capacity. Take this with a grain of salt, of course. Is this true? You can plot that for on your own, clearly. It's actually not terribly untrue, especially in GPUs. For example, in GPUs, core count is increasing very fast, but memory capacity is actually much worse than what's plotted over here. So you're not getting a lot of capacity per core. In CPUs, maybe in some CPUs, the core count is not increasing as fast today, but there's a reason. The reason is, if you increase the core count, you're not going to be able to get memory. That's why people are not increasing the core count as much. They're increasing other things on chip, like caches, for example. So these two have some interdependency with each other also, actually. But there is some truth to this today in different domains, and it's actually much worse in GPUs. It's maybe a little bit better today in CPUs, but essentially what they projected at that time was memory capacity per core is expected to drop by 30% every 2 years. Now, this is not good, because software has always relied on having more memory capacity per thread, because most software is actually single-threaded. Even if you are multi-threaded, you have not a massive amount of threads in many workloads. And if you actually drop the memory capacity, if you don't give enough memory capacity, the software doesn't scale very well. You don't get more features. Okay. And actually, if you look at the trends for memory bandwidth per core, it's not plotted here. They're actually much worse. The memory bandwidth per core is increasing by about 10% per year in the DDR technology. Again, take that with a grain of salt. It may change, especially with 3D stacking, it changes. I don't take that into account over here. But if core count is doubling and memory bandwidth is increasing 10% per year, then we have a huge problem. Essentially, this also points out to the fact that we know how to design these cores. We know how to stamp them out. We know how to put many of them. But we don't know how to supply them with data in terms of both capacity and bandwidth. And there are many examples. Let me give you another example. We'll have some fun with this picture over here, which you don't see yet. So the picture will look like something like this. Essentially, we're going to look at the trends in a DRAM chip in the last 18 years until 2017. And we're going to look at how much capacity has improved, bandwidth has improved, and latency has improved over the last 18 years in the most common device of its day. This is DDR technology. There are many, many types of DRAM chips today, which we may go into a little bit. But DDR technology is the most common commodity type that's used everywhere. LPDDR, low-power DDR, is one example of it also. So let me ask you the question. How much do you think DRAM capacity has improved over the last 18 years that are depicted here? Any takers? It's okay to be wrong, because I'm going to give you the right answer. 32x, right? Okay, any other takers? Who thinks it's higher than 32? Okay, 2 more. Who thinks it's lower than 32? Nobody thinks it's lower? Everybody else thinks it's 32? Higher. Okay, the ones who said higher are correct. It's actually better than 32. Maybe not that much better, but 128x in the last 18 years. Which is not bad, as you can see, right? And clearly it's been growing exponentially for some time, but now we're having difficulties. As you can see, it's not growing as fast. Basically, this is the number of bits you can put on a given area, right? And this is actually what memory chips are designed for. If you go to a DRAM manufacturer, this is what they design their chips for. Maximizing cost per bit, or maximizing bits per area. And even that metric they're having difficulties with today. And we'll see, this is really the technology scaling problem. Okay, let's talk about bandwidth. What about bandwidth? How much do you think that has improved? Lower than that one. Okay, that's correct. How much lower? 20x. That's actually perfect. There you go, you get 20x. And this is DDR technology again. This is not optimized for high bandwidth. Like GDDR, graphics DDR is optimized for higher bandwidth. 3D stacking is optimized for higher bandwidth. But DDR is the most common technology that we have, and it's 20x. Now granted, bandwidth is a bit easier to improve compared to what I'm going to show you next. It's not as easy as capacity, because capacity you can cram more bits, right? Bandwidth, you're limited by the interface. You're limited by the interconnect between the processor and memory. You're limited by the pins that you have out of the chip. So you're very much bound by power considerations over here, whereas you're not much bound by power over here, right? That's why this is improved less over here. But again, if you really want to increase bandwidth, you can put more money into it, which consumes more power, and you need to cool it somehow. But this is not terrible, I think. This is doable in my opinion. Okay, what about latency? How much latency has reduced over the last 18 years? Clearly it's lower, because I already gave you that answer. But how much lower? Less than 10x. You give a very loose upper bound. 3x. Okay, 3x. That's a better upper bound. We can keep going lower. So latency is actually pretty bad. It's reduced by only 30%. And this is also surprising to me, actually. I was expecting less than 30% in the last 18 years, but it is really 30% in the DRAM standard. If you go back to 1999, it's 30% higher. But clearly, existing chips are, this is due to multiple reasons, actually. I mean, I've given you the limits for bandwidth, but limits for latency is really, again, interconnects. The interconnects are limiting the latency. And also the mindset, actually. People are not designing these chips for latency today. And whenever they design chips for latency, they increase the cost. And there's a fundamental trade-off between latency and cost, as we will discuss when we talk about latency. But going forward, it's going to be more important, in my opinion, how to actually design these chips so that we can actually reduce the latency as much as possible without increasing the cost a lot. And I'm going to give you some idea directions when we talk about latency. But this is, I think, a very instructive picture to think about. There's also another reason why this is not improved as much, is also the mindset. The mindset is that people want to design chips that are just higher capacity at the expense of other stuff, like latency. But that mindset may need to change going forward, especially if you want more predictability out of our systems that we're designing. I mean, as I mentioned, I did my PhD thesis on tolerating these latencies in the processor. And when we get to it, we'll maybe talk about it. I designed a mechanism that's energy efficient, that can tolerate the latencies without increasing the complexity of the processor a lot. And I like that idea, but I think we still need to do something more fundamental. As opposed to tolerating latencies with caches, prefetching mechanisms, multi-threading, better out-of-order core designs, maybe we should just reduce the latency in the memory so that we don't need to design all of those complicated mechanisms, right? And if you push processing inside the memory, fundamentally, you're a bit lower latency actually over there. But still, you need to do more over there to reduce the latency of the access of the data. Okay, so this is, again, giving you some more applications. So clearly, performance, we're having all these performance-related trends, but performance is really important for many applications. These are some applications that we know more or less a lot about. We don't know a lot about going forward bioinformatics, for example, but we know a lot about these applications. And we know that they're bottlenecked by memory latency, memory bandwidth, and memory capacity. Like if you look at an in-memory database, it's a complex interaction of all of those. Graph processing, we'll talk about that. It's a complex, actually random accesses dominate a lot of graph processing workloads. This is used in a lot of machine learning frameworks, increasingly bioinformatics frameworks, clearly social networks, many kind of networks. It's all over, and we have a lot of random accesses. So these actually exercise a latency bottleneck a lot, in addition to capacity and bandwidth. That's true for other workloads as well, and we're going to cover this paper sometime later. Okay, so memory is a performance bottleneck, basically. And if you look at the smaller scale workloads, which are also very important because they're everywhere in our lives, they're also bottlenecked by memory. I mean, in this case, I show Google's workloads because we've done a study with Google, and I just copied and pasted the slide from there. But you can imagine these workloads existing in any machine, right? A small machine. And you see that memory is a performance bottleneck over there. And we're going to cover this work later on. And this is actually the data from my own PhD thesis. But before I describe that, let me tell you this quote over here. So we know actually memory performance is critical. Does anybody know this name, Richard Seitz? Okay, you're not that old. Does anybody know what alpha is? Alpha processor? Okay. Okay, good. So alpha architecture is dead right now. It doesn't exist, clearly. It existed. Maybe some machines still exist. But basically, this was digital equipment's flagship architecture at the time. And Dick Seitz was the chief architect of Alpha 21264, which was the fastest machine of its time. This is actually faster than Intel's machines in 1996. It was 500 megahertz, first 500 megahertz of its day. It did. It's a very nice design, actually. But after he and his team designed this processor, Dick Seitz wrote an article, one-page article in Microprocessor Report. I would recommend you take a look at it. It's linked somewhere on my course website. And Abdullah, if you could remind me, I can actually collect these readings. So this is one reading that we can put up. So he wrote this one-page article, which is titled that way. It's the memory, stupid. Basically, in this article, the gist of it is he says, we designed this processor very hard to finish 4 instructions every cycle, every clock cycle. And in this important workload that we designed it for, it's finishing 1 instruction every 4 cycles. So it's really operating at 1/16th of its peak bandwidth, right? 1/16th is a very low number, right? It's less than 7%. Yes, it's less than 7%. It's a bit higher than 6%. And then he basically concludes the article saying that all future microprocessor designs should focus on the memory subsystem. Period. Which is very instructive. And I agree with that, actually. But not just future microprocessor designs, but future system designs should focus on the memory subsystem. So that's 1996, right? I did my PhD thesis in 2006. I finished in 2006, but our first results were published in 2003. At that time, we actually looked at workloads that Intel used to design its processor with. This is 147 workloads. And we basically looked at what fraction of the execution time is devoted, spent on what. And most of the time, the processor is waiting for L2 cache misses, long latency cache misses. This is average across 147 workloads. It's not just one workload. Some workloads are 95% over here, right? And actually, the green part is very instructive as well because I say non-stall time over here. Not all of it is useful time because some of it is wasted on speculation. So the useful time is really 10 to 20% over here. So we're designing these processors, and most of the time, they're waiting for data. They're doing useful computation only 10 to 20% of their time. Okay, we're going to get back to this, actually. So this is really the performance cost of data movement, all of the performance trends related to memory. Okay, now let me switch to the second trend. This is energy and power. Clearly, energy power is a key system design concern today, especially more today. I'm going to give you some data points over here also. This is another paper that I would recommend. You can also search for these papers once you have these slides. These slides will all be available to you. But this is a paper that IBM published in 2003. Charles Lafergie and others in IEEE Computer. It's a very nice paper also that talks about where energy goes in servers. And they basically showed that more than 40% of the entire system energy in their big iron servers, these are big servers that they design, is spent on the off-chip memory hierarchy. And at that time, in 2000 or so, the system was designed in 1999, and they published the paper in 2003. The off-chip memory hierarchy consists of off-chip caches. IBM had big DRAM caches, off-chip interconnect, off-chip memory, and off-chip storage. Fast forward about 10 years later, assume this is 10 years, they basically published another paper, again looking at where energy goes in IBM Power 8 processor. This is, again, another flagship processor that they designed. And they basically said more than 40% of the power is just in DRAM, just the main memory. So now DRAM is consuming a bigger fraction, as you can see, right? And it's going to become bigger. This is true for GPUs. It's another paper that I reference. Again, you can search for the author's name and ISCA, GPU, and you will see that in GPUs, that's also true. More than 40% of the power is in DRAM. And this is increasing. And GPUs have very small DRAM, actually. And they're actually some of the biggest computationally complex machines, right? They have a lot of computational power. Even then, more than 40% of the power is in memory, with small memories in GPUs. Okay, so this is a problem, basically. Memory energy is growing. And on top of this, the technology that we design memory with DRAM consumes power when it's not used. You need to periodically refresh it. This is very similar to human memory, right? Sometimes if you don't refresh, the memory goes away. That's true over here also, but it's much worse here. And this is really wasting a lot of power. We will discuss this problem. I think this is actually very important because this is one of the fundamental problems with technology scaling in DRAM. Refresh. How often you need to refresh. You need to know this. And knowing this is becoming very, very difficult. As a result, people are not able to aggressively scale the size of the DRAM cell to smaller sizes. So we're going to get back to this. Okay, but let me give you, on this energy, a couple of numbers. So this is an exaggerated number. This is actually a slide that I borrowed from Bill Daly in his High Peak keynote a few years ago. So these are old numbers. Keep that in mind. But basically here, he compares the cost of different operations on chip or off chip. This is the energy cost of a 64-bit double precision floating point operation. It's 20 picojoules. And this is the energy cost of a single DRAM read or write, 16 nanojoules. So clearly there is an 800x difference. I'll take the liberty of making that 1,000x. So 3 orders of magnitude difference. In real life, it's actually about between 2 to 3 orders of magnitude today if you heavily optimize the DRAM interface. But still, that's a huge difference. Basically, this is a sophisticated computation. Today is much more energy efficient than a single memory access. So this is the energy cost of the data moment, as you can see. Yes. Okay. Oh, maybe we can put it.
Yeah, just put it wherever.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Could any one of you bring this down to the concierge after?
Okay, thank you. Maybe, yeah, you can set it up so that people are more comfortable. Or maybe people can exploit locality to get, because there's a data movement problem, air movement problem from there to there, right? If you're closer, you'll get more air. I'm not sure if that solves the problem, but hopefully it mitigates a bit. Okay, so as you can see, a single memory access consumes a lot of energy. And again, this is dependent on technology, depends on how much you optimize these, but this is very fundamental. You have very heavy interconnects over here, and it's very hard to make them very energy efficient. On-chip interconnects are much more energy efficient. And you don't see it over here, but this is 1 nanojoule to communicate between different parts of the chip. I'll show you this picture later on. Okay, so given this, it's good to ask the question, you want to do a double precision floating point operation. You need to bring 2 numbers. You need to do 2 memory accesses. And then you compute the result. And then you write the result with 1 more memory access. And if you're never going to reuse any of that data, does it make sense to do 3 memory accesses to do that computation? Basically, you're wasting a lot of energy if you do that. If you have a lot of very good locality, maybe it makes sense. But then you need to have very good locality so that you really operate most of the time here. But that's not the case in many workloads today. Okay, So this is the paper that I mentioned that we did with Google. Basically, we looked at those 4 workloads that I showed you: Chrome browser, the TensorFlow inference engine for different types of networks, and video encoding and decoding. And I'm going to talk about this paper when we talk about processing in memory a little bit more in detail. But essentially, what we found out, one of the key findings of this work was that more than 60% of the total system energy in a mobile device like this or a Chromebook is spent on data movement, solely on moving the data across the memory hierarchy. Okay, so the third major trend on top of this is that we're having difficulties with technology scaling. That's why you see that curve of capacity increasing exponentially. Well, linear means exponential in a log scale, as you can see, right? But it's flattening out, and we're having problems with it. So what does technology scaling mean? Technology scaling is reducing the size of a circuit, right? And as you reduce the size of the circuit, you get higher capacity per area, which is good, density, lower cost, and lower energy, or reasonable energy at least. Now we're having difficulties with this because as we reduce the size of the circuit, first of all, energy is not reducing as much today. This is called Dennard scaling. Bob Dennard is actually the person who invented DRAM in 1965. He also had this scaling theory, technology scaling theory. It's called Dennard scaling. As you reduce the size of the circuit, you get energy reductions as well, but that's becoming not so feasible today. Because things are too small and energy is not reducing as much. So as a result, I'm going to go into this more later on. But as a result, institutions like International Technology Roadmap of Semiconductors, which used to do a lot of projections on how technology will scale into the future, has been predicting for a long time that the size of a DRAM cell will not scale easily below X nanometers. That's the future size of a DRAM cell. And I put X over here because they used to change their projections every year. But I don't want to keep my slide coherent with their projections. So we'll see what that X is, actually. Actually, let me ask you the question. Does anybody know what's the future size of a DRAM cell in the cutting edge technology that we have today? Any guesses? 7 nanometers. You're very optimistic. Even in logic, we're not at 7 nanometers yet. Well, I guess we are. But DRAM technology is much harder because of the capacitor. So we're not at 7 nanometers yet, but I like your optimism. Any other guesses? 20? Okay. 32? You're very pessimistic. We see the optimists and pessimists here. Or maybe random number generators, I don't know. Yeah, today we're closer to 20 actually. Today it's about 17 nanometers. So we've scaled down a lot actually. When I created the slide, ITRS was projecting that it would be difficult to scale below 35 nanometers. And they were right actually. Clearly the speed of scaling has reduced below 35 nanometers. And there are other issues that came about. And we're going to cover some of those issues. Well, basically, let me go into a little bit more detail. Essentially, if you want to scale the technology, you want to reduce the size of a cell. So what does this mean? Since this course is about memory, in my opinion, every memory is, different types of memory technologies have similarities. For example, for any memory technology to work, you need to have a good storage device, reliable storage device, and a reliable access device. If you don't have both of them, then your memory will not work. In DRAM, the storage device is the capacitor. Essentially, you trap charge in capacitor, and that stores the data. And for this memory to work, the storage device should work. The capacitor must be large enough for reliable sensing. But also, the access device should work. So access transistor must be large enough for low leakage of the data. There's an RC path from the capacitor to the spit line. So if you have a lot of leakage over here, you have a problem with your access device, right? And also, your bit line and sense amplifier should work also. So people put a lot of effort into the design of the sense amplifier, for example, to be good. But it turns out reducing the size of the cell makes both of those properties difficult to maintain. The capacitor becomes smaller, less reliable, and the access transistor becomes more leaky and more vulnerable to random effects. Actually, we will see quantum-like effects here where the access transistor randomly becomes extremely leaky and you lose charge very quickly. And that's really one of the biggest scaling problems that manufacturers are facing today. They do not know how long this capacitor will retain charge because of these random quantum-like effects that you get into, especially at very small technology nodes. So this was a value that was assigned to X by ITRS in 2009. Basically, in 2009, they said that reducing the feature size of the cell below 35 nanometers is challenging. And they were right. It was challenging. As a result, all of these are hard to scale. And meaning that the things we want from memory are difficult to maintain, right? We want better energy, but we're not getting better energy. We're actually getting more leaky transistors. We want more capacity, but we're not getting more capacity, at least as fast, right? So we're having difficulties, basically. And this is true for other charge-based memories also, actually. DRAM is charge-based memory. Charge is stored in the capacitor. But we have another technology that's extremely successful also, flash memory, that has enabled a lot of these devices, right? I cannot imagine having this device without flash memory, for example. Otherwise, where would people be storing their pictures, right? And running out of flash space over here, or videos, right? So basically, in flash also, you capture charge in the floating gate. It's also charge-based. And in all of these charge-based memories, reliable sensing becomes very difficult as the charge storage unit size reduces. If we have time, we'll talk about flash memory technology. We will see how we arrange. Also, what topics we cover will be dependent on your interest a little bit also. But this is a fascinating technology as well. And when you reduce the size of the flash cell, you're also vulnerable to a lot of these effects that I just briefly mentioned. In a different way, but still, you have a lot of reliability issues. So that's essentially, as you scale the memory, very fundamentally, you'll run into reliability issues. So this is one example of the data that we gathered in the large scale. Essentially, one of my students went to Facebook to do an internship. He now is a research scientist at Facebook. Basically, what we did was we analyzed all of the Facebook's servers at that time and recorded all of the memory errors for 1.5 years. And we looked at the correlation between the memory error rate or server failure rate and the density of the chip that's employed in these production servers. So this can be only a correlational study because this is actually running production in production, and it's a lot of servers. They don't allow us to write how many servers, how much memory, because apparently that's confidential and that affects their stock price. But I think they have other stuff to worry about in terms of privacy with respect to their stock price. But so they're somehow handling it. I don't know why. But anyway, essentially we found a strong correlation between the chip density that's employed in the server and the failure rate that you record in terms of the error rate. And again, if you really want to understand how this is computed, you need to look at the paper because it's a normalized measure that you need to do. Otherwise, you cannot compare different servers, right, clearly. Because the same server cannot be replaced with different memory while in production. And this correlation indicates that because the memory chips are getting denser, cells are getting closer to each other, they're becoming more vulnerable to these errors. And if you really want to know more, this is, even though it's a 4-year-old study now, it's one of the largest, I think it's actually the largest scale study that's been done in terms of memory errors in the field. There are a lot of other data that we present in this paper. In the past, there was a study from Google also, which was also very interesting, but it was done on a smaller set of servers. Okay, so this is one example. We've been studying these scaling issues also at the small scale in a more controlled way. Here we have actually, this is our FPGA-based infrastructure. Each of these FPGAs is running a memory test, and you can control the memory test with heating and temperature. And we're going to talk a lot about this infrastructure to understand the scaling issues. And we actually open source this infrastructure. If you want to have an FPGA to test your memory, you can buy the FPGA. Sorry, we don't provide the FPGA, but we provide the software. It's open source. This is actually a memory testing software. It's a very soft memory controller that can be programmed using a C++ API. You cannot do everything in the memory controller in this case. We're extending it right now to do other stuff. But you can do simple memory tests using the C++ API. And if you're interested in testing your memory, we'd be happy to support it if you have. And this is a paper that describes that infrastructure. It was published in HPCA in 2017. But we built this infrastructure to understand the scaling issues like retention time. And retention time we will talk about in the next lecture. But one of the things that we found out was this problem called RowHammer problem. How many people are familiar with RowHammer here? Okay, a lot of people. Wow, that's amazing. It's becoming more popular. What about Meltdown and Spectre? Okay, a lot of people too. That's good. So basically, RowHammer is very interesting. I'm going to talk about RowHammer tomorrow more, or maybe today, depending on how fast we go. But basically, we found out that you can predictably induce errors in most DRAM memory chips. Essentially, by hammering a row, keeping on activating it, you can induce errors in adjacent memory rows. So this clearly should not happen, right? Because you're just reading memory, and you're inducing errors in some other part of memory. And you can do this predictably, meaning that if you induce errors in a bit, you're very likely to induce errors in that bit again and again and again, which means that somebody can build an attack on top of this. So this is an example. I think this is the most concrete example of the memory scaling problems that we have. You can induce errors in memory chips. Essentially, it's a simple hardware failure mechanism that can create a widespread system security vulnerability, and as a result, people are writing interesting articles like this. I like this because this is actually very nice in terms of from a security perspective. Basically, these folks, there have been a lot of work in security and software, clearly, which is very, very important. But it's good to have this sort of headline in a mainstream place like Wired, talking about physics and hardware security issues as opposed to just software security issues. So we'll talk more about this because this is, I think, very, very interesting. And we're going to have more and more such problems as technology scales to smaller nodes. And I'm going to give you sample papers over here, but you can take a look at these. It's a short paper that describes the RowHammer problem and other issues we may face as memory becomes denser. And this is actually your first required reading. We recently wrote this paper, spent a lot of effort. It was selected to a special issue on topics in hardware embedded security. After 5 years, we published a RowHammer paper. It was first published in ISCA 2014, and they invited us to do this work. Here we cover the RowHammer problem as well as the works that built on it in the next 5 years. A lot of the security attacks, which are actually very nice, I think, and a lot of the solutions and a lot of the understanding that people have built. But this is very interesting, and that's why this is a required reading, because we're going to cover this as part of the course. I guess to take credit, you need to do some required assignments, right? Not just attend the lectures. Is that true? Say it again?
I don't know. I think it's up to you.
Oh, it's up to me. Okay. Well, I think, do you prefer an exam or, well, we'll talk about that in the course logistics. I'll ask you the question, do you prefer an exam or do you prefer to do paper reviews? Start thinking about it now. You don't need to have an answer at this point. Oh, I see. Okay. That's a good question. How about 20? Yeah, maybe there's a threshold, right? You can draw the curve. Which one do you prefer? Maybe there's an exponential curve. As the paper count increases, you prefer the exam. I don't know. I would prefer reading papers over an exam, but everybody's different. Especially in a PhD level course. But of course, you should ask the other question also, what is the exam like? Right? Okay, anyway, jokes aside, we're going to talk about the course logistics after we take a break. Essentially, DRAM scaling has become increasingly difficult. RowHammer is a very concrete and real example of it that has had tremendous impact on especially the system security community. And I think there are going to be more. Of course, people are going to be much more careful after RowHammer, right? They're going to try to fix all of those issues beforehand if possible. It may not be easily possible all the time because especially if you're cost sensitive, it's difficult to fix some of these issues. So clearly this has become more difficult because we are having a lot of difficulty. We're going to talk more about that. It's difficult to significantly improve capacity and energy. As a result, emerging memory technologies are looking even more promising today. And some of the emerging memory technologies are still DRAM-based. Some of them are not DRAM-based. So for example, 3D stacked DRAM is very interesting. It buys you higher bandwidth. Reduced latency DRAM is very interesting. It exists at very high cost today, but there are lower cost variants that we will talk about. Clearly, lower latency is very interesting. Low power DRAM is actually probably going to dominate a lot of the markets going forward, in my opinion, because we need low power interfaces. But of course, there are downsides to this, as you will see over here. And non-volatile memory, I club a lot of these different technologies here as non-volatile memory, and there are many other examples. But 3D Xpoint is one example that's really hit the market recently. Does anybody know about 3D Point? This is Intel's persistent memory. I don't know what, it's Optane SSD, but it's Optane's memory version. SSD version is storage, clearly, but the memory version, I don't know how they market it as. Do you remember? Does anybody know? I think of that at 3D Point, but Intel probably has a marketing name for it. You can buy these DIMMs on the market. They're a bit expensive. I think the price I saw was about $2,500 for a reasonably large chip, like 128 gigabytes probably, but still pretty expensive compared to DRAM. But they exist actually today with 3D Point. We're going to talk about the history of it a little bit. Like the first paper we wrote on it was 2009. It's great to see the technology coming into life in 2019. That's a decade. That's good. That's the beauty of research, right? You plant a seed and it happens. Of course, among other things, this has a larger capacity advantage, but persistence is another advantage. And you can add more over here. Essentially, because of the scaling difficulties, memory space is proliferating. There are different types of memory that are coming up. And I believe if I were a DRAM manufacturer, for example, I would be pushing different technologies. I'll be customizing my memory so that I can make more money out of it. That's not my goal in academia, but if I were a DRAM manufacturer, I wouldn't be sticking to the DRAM technology because I think that's going to proliferate a lot. But the downside is, as you can see over here, there's no single memory technology that's good at everything. We want everything from memory, different metrics, and we want to maximize all of those metrics. But no technology is good at all of those metrics. It's all a trade-off, basically. Every technology has some greens and has some reds. And here I showed the most salient greens and most salient reds over here. Maybe I was a bit harsh on the non-volatile memory over here because I put 3 over here, as you can see. But we will see that a little bit more. There's an interesting story here. For example, when STT-MRAM was first marketed, there's a lot of marketing over here that you need to be careful about too. People said, oh, this is the best memory technology ever. It's good at everything. And quickly people figured out that it's not good at everything. So people are searching for a memory technology that's green at every single metric. But I think it's going to be very hard to find that, frankly. Clearly, I didn't include SRAM over here because SRAM has significant issues to scale to very large technology nodes or very large sizes. But you can imagine SRAM over here also and Flash over here as well. But they're not emerging clearly. OK, so as a result of this proliferation and the fact that there's no single technology that's green at everything, this is a major trend that's happening in systems today. Essentially, we're putting multiple different memory technologies on a single node and figuring out how to manage them. Basically, multiple different technologies with complementary greens and complementary reds. If you want to make this work, essentially you need to design your hardware and software to manage the data allocation and movement to achieve the greens of each technology as much as possible while avoiding the reds as much as possible. I think this is a fascinating area, and there's a lot of works that we will hopefully discuss when we get to the emerging memory technologies part of the course. And there's going to be more and more, both on the hardware and the software side, to understand this and manage this. And this is already happening, actually. If you look at GPUs, it's becoming similar to this. If you look at CPUs, it's going to become similar if they haven't become similar to this. Basically, you have a fast DRAM, high bandwidth, low latency, high energy, low capacity. And you can have a slow DRAM that's low bandwidth, high latency, very high capacity, and hopefully lower energy than this one. Even without some completely different technology, you can have it with DRAM, actually. And we'll talk about that also. So one foreshadowing, if you have a system like this, you need to have an intelligent controller. Because if you don't have an intelligent controller over here that doesn't understand what's going on between these different technologies, it's very hard to manage this memory. The controller needs to provide functions to accelerate data movement, maybe provide some statistics in terms of which data is accessed over here. We're going to talk about that. So this is one of my first foreshadowing. We need intelligent controllers to enable these hybrid memories. And I'm going to motivate these intelligent controllers more and more with reliability issues in a little bit. So industry is also writing papers about this too. This meaning memory reliability issues. They're also writing papers on hybrid memory, but reliability issues have been concerning them quite a bit. This is a paper that I would recommend. This was written in 2014 in the Memory Forum. And I like this paper because it's written by 2 companies that don't talk to each other normally. except through lawyers. But even through lawyers, the communication bandwidth is very low. Basically, these two companies, they were very gracious to come together and write a paper in the memory forum we organized in 2014. Essentially, these are folks from the DRAM design team at Samsung and memory design team, memory controller team at Intel. And basically, they said that DRAM memory scaling is becoming challenging because we have significant problems with refresh. Write latencies are increasing because the resistances of the transistors are increasing, as you can see over here. And we're having a lot of difficulty determining the retention time of a cell. That's the variable retention time problem, which we were going to focus on more. This is the quantum-like effects I mentioned in the access transistor. Access transistor sometimes becomes very leaky. As a result, your retention time goes down a lot. And they said that this is very difficult for us to solve these problems easily. And they basically talk about some solutions in this work. One of the solutions is actually one of the solutions that we proposed. I'm going to talk about that later on. Subarray level parallelism. They said that you should increase the parallelism inside a memory chip such that you can access subarrays independently so that you can tolerate these latencies better. One of the other solutions is actually employed today. They basically said we should put error correcting codes inside a memory chip so that we can handle some of these issues better. And today's low power DRAM chips have error correcting codes inside them, inside the chip basically. Essentially, they're losing capacity, memory capacity, because they're dedicating some of their memory to error correcting codes, which is not good for them, but they don't have any choice basically. Otherwise, the memory is too unreliable. Another solution, I mean, they mentioned a bunch of solutions, but the general overview of the solution is it's very difficult to continue scaling just by reducing the size of the DRAM cell. We want to make the controllers more intelligent also. That's what they mean by co-architecting controllers and DRAM together. If you have an intelligent controller, it can do this subarray level parallelism much better. As a result, it can tolerate some of these issues better. Refresh is another example that we will talk about. Okay, so I would recommend this paper, but I didn't put it as a required reading. But we may later on. Since you mentioned we'll have 20 readings, right? Okay, so let me switch gears a little bit. So this was the reliability perspective, but there's an orthogonal issue to everything else we discussed, which is the issue of memory interference. It doesn't matter whether your technology scales or doesn't scale over here. If you have multiple different agents accessing your main memory, you have a problem, and that's the problem of interference. Essentially, these cores in this case, but you could think of these different accelerators. I'm going to show you another picture that shows that this problem is getting worse. They interfere with each other when accessing this shared medium. And if you don't control this interference in some way, if you don't have some intelligence in the memory controller, then this could lead to many problems like quality of service, performance. This was actually the first work that I had done when I joined Microsoft Research. We wanted to look at this problem. If you put many cores on chip, and if your memory controller doesn't distinguish between requests from these cores, you run into quality of service issues. We wrote this paper in Unix security that is called memory performance attacks. Essentially, you can have two programs. One program can deny service to another program. In 2007, we looked at that issue. And I think this issue is still very important. But it's very independent of the technology. Like, it doesn't matter what technology you have over here. As long as you have a shared medium, you have this problem. And so there are security problems over here also. Denial of service problem, to be more exact. Although later on, people also found out that if you actually put multiple applications together, they can leak timing information in the memory channel if the memory channel is doesn't protect that timing information. So you could actually discover what data is being transferred in the process that's running next to you. It's not an easy attack by any means. Side channel attacks are never easy. But they show that they could do that because you don't have isolation in the memory controller. OK, so clearly this problem is getting worse. So this is one goal, predictable performance in complex systems. Essentially, memory controllers are being shared by many different types of agents, CPUs, GPUs, hardware accelerators, you know what. And there are different levels of sharing, different amounts of bandwidth. And they all have different kinds of requirements, as you can see over here. I mean, this may have a frame rate requirement sometimes. This may have some other requirements. This may or may not have requirements, clearly based on the user. So this part of the system is getting more complex. And if you look over here, the memory controller is really shared by at least 10 or 15 different types of accelerators, I'll call them. So it's a lot. Memory central, in my opinion, when I look at the system, memory control is really the center of the world, even though the processing is done in these agents over here. And also on the other side, on the memory side is also getting more complex. As we add hybrid memories, you need to consider them in the memory controller. Essentially, this problem is getting worse, basically. And one of the key issues is how do you allocate resources to these heterogeneous agents to mitigate the interference that they're having and provide predictable performance. And this is just part of the problem. If you want security isolation, you need to do even more on top of this. And I think this is a fascinating area also, so hopefully we'll get to talk about some of the issues related to this, maybe in the later parts of this course. Any questions? Does anybody find this fascinating? Yes? Okay, good. Yeah, I found this fascinating. That's one of the reasons why this was the first thing that I focused on at Microsoft Research, actually. And this was actually important for data centers also in real production settings. If you want to collocate two applications together, and if you want to provide some service level agreement guarantee, you cannot if your memory controller is prioritizing one application over the other because it has some nice access patterns. Right? Okay, so essentially you need intelligent memory controllers for this purpose also. In fact, this was the early reasons why we wanted intelligent memory controllers over here, so that you can have these sophisticated functions in memory. In fact, since we're dreaming, I mean, we didn't do this yet, but I think memory controllers, it makes a lot of sense for memory controllers to be configurable also, because sometimes you want algorithms in the memory controllers depend on the application that you're running. And if you can somehow instantiate a memory controller algorithm based on the application that you're running in the memory controller, you can do much more, as opposed to having rigid algorithms that are designed by some random hardware designer that thought it was good to design that. Wouldn't it be nice if you actually had a programmable or configurable memory controller that you could instantiate a scheduling algorithm on depending on what your application is? I call this a library memory controllers, for example. You have a library for different memory control algorithms, and based on what you want to do, you just instantiate that, call that particular library. Of course, we're not there yet. So, okay, we want intelligent controllers for that reason also. Okay, so let me go a little bit more into detail in this, and we'll take a break at the end of this, and then we'll talk about course logistics at the beginning. Is anybody exhausted yet? I think maybe because of the heat. So heat is not very good, as you can see, right? We'll see that heat is not very good for circuits also. Okay, so let me talk about some solution directions first, and then we're going to take a break. So how do we solve the memory problem? It's not a simple problem because there are many facets of it, as you can see. It's not a single metric that we're optimizing for. So one solution is to fix it, making memory and controllers more intelligent. And I think we need to optimize, consider all of those solutions. So this requires new interfaces, new functions, and new architecture. I call this the system memory co-design. And we're going to talk a lot about this going forward. The second solution is trying to eliminate or minimizing some of these issues. Like, I think a lot of the issues are caused by DRAM, but that's not the only issue, as you can see. If we can somehow find a great technology that we can replace DRAM with, it'd be great. But unfortunately, it's not easy. But we need to look for new technologies and maybe have a system-wide rethinking of memory and storage. So we're going to talk about this also. And maybe the third solution, at least this is referring to a lot of the scaling issues. Maybe we should embrace some of the scaling issues that we have. For example, if we can say some of the memory that we have is unreliable and we're going to still use it, that would be great. The question is how to do that, of course, right? Maybe we can even design some memories that are heterogeneous, none of which are perfect, and we can map data intelligently across them. And this could lead to new models for data management and maybe usage. They don't necessarily need to be unreliable. They could be different completely. This is essentially hybrid memory. So I think these are all very interesting directions, but all of these directions require some broad thinking. It's not, you cannot just fix the problem at a single level, basically. You cannot just magically introduce a device like 3D Xpoint and expect that it'll work perfectly, at least in many cases, right? So the solution to this problem really requires thinking across the stack, software, hardware, and device cooperation, understanding the devices, understanding the software, understanding the interfaces. That's why this is a fascinating problem, I think. It doesn't have a simple single-shot solution. unless someone comes up with a great memory technology. But people have been waiting for that technology for decades and decades. Arguably, DRAM is that technology, actually. In 1965, when it was first introduced, DRAM was not scalable, yes, but it scaled greatly over time. And it was that technology for a long time, right? But now it doesn't exist. Well, it exists clearly. It's important. And we should push the boundaries of it, but it's falling short. That's why we need to think really across the stack here. OK, so I'll give you a broad overview of the solution directions, and we're going to cover a lot of these in the rest of the lecture. Basically, what is the first solution direction is basically looking at new memory architectures. We'd like to overcome memory shortcomings with a more memory-centric system design. This means that we'd like to look at new memory architectures, new interfaces, new functions. For example, it'd be nice if we could talk to the memory and say, memory, can you do this for me? And if the memory says, oh, yes, I can execute this function for you, you ship the function, or you decide whether or not to ship the function. And we also need to do better waste management, more efficient utilization. This, I'm not sure if we will focus on a lot, but this is very important also. Even though we have a lot of memory today, we're wasting a lot of it. There are a lot of results that are showing that like 30 to 40% of memory is zeros. Basically, we're storing a lot of zeros in memory. And people are looking at compressing memory a lot. And we did some work in compressing memory. I'm not sure if we will have time to cover that, but that's also very important, more efficient utilization. Again, that requires across-the-stack solutions. So there are some key issues to tackle. We're going to cover all of them. Enabling reliability at low cost is very important, I think, because this leads to high capacity. At the same time, we want to reduce energy. At the same time, we want to reduce latency. And if you look at reliability and energy, these are two sides of the same coin. You can always become more reliable by expending more energy and more cost. For example, the refresh problem. You don't know how often you should refresh DRAM? Refresh it extremely often, right? That solves the reliability problem. Refresh is essentially a reliability problem because you lose charge in the capacitor, right? Basically, refresh it every nanosecond. That solves the problem. But it sounds terrible, right? So clearly, that's not... or have error-correcting codes, extremely large error-correcting codes, so that you don't need to refresh it. That's one other solution. But that goes against energy also, and also latency as well. So these, improving bandwidth is important still. Reducing waste is important. Actually, we're wasting not only capacity, but we're wasting bandwidth. Because we're transferring 64 bytes, let's say, in a general-purpose processor, but we may not need all of those bytes. We're wasting latency, as we will discuss. We actually spend a lot of time waiting for memory, but maybe we don't need to wait that much because the data is ready much earlier, because there's a lot of margin that is put into the timing parameters in memory today. We will discuss that a lot. Basically, we can reduce the waste in terms of all of these, and that could lead to a much better system. And I think enabling computation close to data, making the controllers intelligent, helps with all of these actually on top of them. That's why it's going to be one of the major things that we will discuss. Because if you enable computation, you can help reliability, and you can also reduce latency, energy, improve bandwidth because you're much closer to the memory arrays themselves, and hopefully reduce the waste with more intelligent handling of data. OK, so we're going to cover a lot of these. And this is a list of the papers that we've written in this area. I'm not going to cover all of that, sorry. I keep reducing the font size, but I don't think all of them exist over here. We started the new memory architectures direction. I mean, arguably, the work we did on memory performance attacks and quality of service where memory control is also new memory architectures, but I think of this as when we first started tackling the refresh problem. And our first paper was in ISCA 2012. I'll talk about that work. And there's a lot of work that we've done, which is really interesting, I think. And if you have ideas, I'd love to discuss them with you also. Maybe this will give you some ideas as well. There are a lot of really interesting ideas to be discovered. And I think this is a very open space still. OK, so the second solution direction is emerging memory technologies. This is also very fascinating, I think. There are some emerging memory technologies that seem more scalable than DRAM because they're resistive. They're not charge-based. Charge-based technologies are harder to scale. And on top of this, they are non-volatile. So you can think of these as orthogonal dimensions, and they all have these resistive and non-volatile characteristics, which is great. So one example is phase change memory. Intel's 3DX point is supposedly based on this. I don't think they ever publicly acknowledged it. They call it 3DX point. They never say phase change memory, but if you are familiar with the literature, it's very, 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 very likely it's phase change memory. This is actually a very old material. It was developed in the 1960s late 1950s. You basically store data by changing the phase of some material, and there are different types of materials, like chalcogenide glass is one of them. And you read the data by detecting the material's resistance. So it's completely resistive. And it's used in, for example, rewritable CDs. How many of you use rewritable CDs now? You still use rewritable? Okay, oh, some people use them. I don't use them. But I guess you could call them relatively old technology. So it's used in rewritable CDs. It has its impact. But rewritable CD is a very slow access medium, right? So you shine light on it, so it has different reflexivity. We'll talk about that. And it gives you different data based on how it reflects the light, based on the resistance that's inside here. But now it's very interesting because people figured out, so we knew so this is very instructive, I think. Basically, people knew the beauty or the importance of the storage device very well. So storage device is this chalcogenide glass, for example, the resistive device. But the access device is extremely important also. Access device, if it's really slow, you cannot use it as main memory. And in rewritable CDs, the access device is light-based, essentially. Well, people recently figured out how to build access devices that are relatively fast, that are basically based on some current measurements. IBM did a lot of work in this area, actually, and this is a beautiful paper by IBM that was written in 2008, as early as 2008. And they prototyped at 20 nanometers in 2008. DRAM is at 17 nanometers today, and we're at 2019. And this is actually an old number, ITRS, when they were projecting that DRAM doesn't easily scale below 35 nanometers, they were saying phase change memory is expected to scale to 9 nanometers because it's resistive again. Charge movement is not a big problem because you're not based on charge over here. And you can also store multiple bits per cell here, so it could be denser than DRAM. The problem is, and this is just one example technology, which I believe is real at this point in memory, but there are other technologies like STT-MRAM, memristors, RAM, which are also very interesting. The problem is emerging technologies have many shortcomings, as Intel is also finding out with their existing device right now. For example, latency is a big problem. Energy is a big problem. Energy in terms of access energy. They don't have a big refresh problem. That's one of the reasons they're also scalable, but they have an access energy problem, as we will see. The key question is, can we somehow enable them to replace, augment, or maybe even surpass DRAM? Because it's possible to surpass DRAM if you have persistence, right? If this is non-volatile, and if you can manipulate non-volatile data directly inside the memory, you cannot do that in DRAM because DRAM loses data. It's not persistent. Maybe you can surpass DRAM in this case. So there's a lot of potential benefit over here still that needs to be figured out. But this also requires across-the-stack analysis. And this is some of the papers. We didn't write as many papers in this area, but I think there's more to come. But we're going to talk about some of these. This is our earliest work in ISCA 2009 that I mentioned that talks about replacing DRAM with phase change memory, or how do you architect phase change memory as an alternative to DRAM. Okay, so I think the future looks more like this, in my opinion, because there's no technology that's good at everything. So we need to put multiple technologies together and somehow manage them. And I think this is clearly a very important research area as well. So I'll give you one example of this. We're going to cover this in a little bit more detail, but it doesn't have to be just DRAM and technology X or completely different types of DRAM. It may be slightly different types of DRAM also. Why? You can exploit application level properties. For example, not all applications have or different data in the same application have the same tolerance to errors. For example, you may have some data. Whenever you get a bit flip in that data, error in that data, your computation is useless. Your system crashes. Maybe a pointer in a system data structure gets an error, and then you're done. But there may be some other data that's not so vulnerable, right? And this could be, I don't know, it could be some training data that you feed into your neural network, right? You get a bit flip over there, maybe you're okay, right? Because it's all a statistical process anyway, and that error may not be any different from the error that you see in the input data, as long as it's tolerable. Or it could be some pixel. This is a very classic example, right? It could be some pixel in your screen, right? Maybe it doesn't matter, right? So if you can somehow identify your vulnerability of the data to errors, maybe there's a different way of designing the memory system completely, right? So you have vulnerable data and tolerant data. This is black and white right now, but you can think of different shades of gray clearly, right? What is the different levels of vulnerability? And somebody specifies this. I'm not saying this is an easy task, but if somebody can do it, and maybe there needs to be research on how to do this at the higher levels of the stack, including programmers, compilers, and system software. But if somebody identifies this, now you can actually design two different types of memory that can accommodate the needs of this different data. One could be extremely reliable, and one could be not so reliable, low cost. Maybe it gives you some error bounds. And this is called heterogeneous reliability memory. We first talked about the idea in this DSN paper in 2014. And there, of course, a huge design space over here, right? How do you design this memory? How do you design this memory? If you have shades of gray, how do you design the shades of gray, right? In this paper, we look at different examples. So for example, here you can have ECC protection, error correcting codes, well-tested chips. If you look at the testing cost of DRAM, it's most of the cost of DRAM actually. If you don't test your chips as much, and if you can still get reasonable error bounds, maybe it's okay, right? Maybe you have no ECC over here. Maybe you have parity protection so that you can catch some of those errors and do something about them if you need to. But this can be very low-cost memory. And we did this study with Microsoft Real Applications, actually. We looked at their web search workload in this paper. And my student, Yishin, modified the web search workload by hand. At a coarse grain, he figured out what is the vulnerable data and what is the tolerant data in this workload. And he mapped it to these different memories. And at that time, our goal was slightly different, basically. We wanted to get rid of ECC in the data center. So if you look at all of these big companies, they have ECCs in their data center memories. And that's a lot of cost, a lot of power, and some complexity in the memory controller. They wanted to get rid of it as much as possible. And we showed that you can actually get rid of a lot of the ECC if you do this partitioning. Some DIMMs have ECC, most DIMMs don't have ECC essentially. And that reduces the hardware cost a lot while still having, guaranteeing a good availability target. And if you have a distributed system, you can tolerate the errors even better and you can get even higher availability. But this is one example. I think there's a lot more to do in this direction because I think this is really scratching the surface. There are some other works building on this after that, but I think there's more to do. And this is the work that I mentioned over here. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. But that's one example of the hybrid memory. And as I said, memory interference is orthogonal. And today, memory interference between cores is mostly uncontrolled, although Intel has introduced a lot of new stuff in the caches, but not in the memory controllers, not much in the memory controllers. And if you don't have interference that's controlled, you always have problems with controllability, predictability, and essentially vulnerability. So the solution direction over here is to make the memory interference more controlled, more quality of service over memory systems. And what is the idea over here? Essentially, you design the hardware to provide a configurable fairness substrate. You can do application-aware memory scheduling, partitioning, and throttling. Essentially, you can enable some sort of isolation and control. And the software is designed to configure the resources to satisfy different quality of service and isolation goals between the applications. Of course, there's a lot to do also here, but these can actually provide both predictable performance and higher efficiency, and higher performance also, because as we will see later on, if you have one application denying service to another for a really long time, even if it's not a denial of service or security problem, it may not be a concern for you. But the system performance also goes down because only one core is making progress, assuming these are two cores, right? Okay, so there are multiple ways of looking into this, basically. One way of looking into it is basically how do we provide strong memory service guarantees in main memory? And the goal we've been pursuing is how do you satisfy performance or service level agreement requirements in the presence of all of these shared resources. And one of the approaches that we've been taking more recently is we'd like to somehow develop techniques or models to accurately estimate the performance loss of an application in the presence of resource sharing. So you have some performance if you don't share the resources, that's performance X, and you have some performance Y when you share resources with another application. The question is, can you know how much you're slowing down compared to your baseline performance where you don't share the resources? If you can estimate this dynamically online, then you can now enable many, many solutions potentially, right? Because this is just an estimation problem. While the application is running, you know how much is being slowed down because of this resource sharing. Now, if you know that information, you can feed that information to the memory controller, and the memory controller, for example, can do resource, or caches, can do resource partitioning and prioritization to ensure that the slowdowns are at levels that are tolerable or that are requested by the user. So for example, when I press a button over here, I have some requirement, latency guarantee, and if that requirement is not being satisfied, that application should be prioritized, right? Of course, all the while providing high system performance, because this is a really easy problem to solve otherwise, right? If your goal is not high system performance, you can design a 1,000-core system, share the memory controller, and if you're running a latency critical application, you ensure that that's the only application that's running in the system and nothing else. Now you wasted all of those 1,000 cores, right? So it's an easy problem to solve if your goal is not high system performance. But we want everything. So maybe we'll get to cover some of these works that develop these slowdown models and then that feed the memory controller and caches so that you can partition the resources accordingly. Okay, so this gave you a broad overview. Basically, this is the agenda for today. Let's see how much we can cover. So I think we've covered already this part. Now we're going to switch to this one. And then we're going to cover some fundamentals of memory, some background. Has everybody taken a computer architecture course here? Yes? And you know about how DRAM works? Not everybody. Who knows about how DRAM works? Don't be shy. Okay, so. That's, yeah. In my experience, not a lot of computer architecture courses cover DRAM. Maybe it's different in the courses that some of you have taken. That's why I wanted to go over some of the basics of how this thing works. And DRAM is an example memory technology. A lot of memory works similarly, actually. So we'll cover a lot of memory basics first, and then we'll delve into some of the key challenges. I'm hoping we'll cover the security and reliability, but I don't think it's going to happen today. We're going to do it tomorrow. By the end of tomorrow, hopefully we'll be done with this part, and we'll start with the in-memory computation. Okay, so that's the end of the first part of the lecture.